Chapter 2. The Delian League, From Alliance to Empire. The birth of a grand alliance. In the scorching summer of 479 BCE, the Greek world stood at a crossroads. The smoking ruins of Athens still smouldered from Persian torches, yet the Greeks had achieved what seemed impossible. They had defeated the mighty Persian Empire not once, but twice. At Marathon in 490 BCE, Athenian hoplites had shattered the myth of Persian invincibility. 10 years later, at Salamis in 480 BCE, Themistocles orchestrated a naval victory that sent Xerxes' massive invasion fleet to the bottom of the Aegean. The final triumph came at Plataea in 479 BCE, where Greek unity delivered a crushing blow to Persian land forces. But as the dust settled and Greek leaders surveyed the devastated landscape, a sobering realization dawned upon them. This was not the end, but merely a pause in a longer struggle. The Persian Empire, stretching from the Indus to the Mediterranean, still commanded vast resources and harbored ambitions of revenge. King Xerxes I, though humiliated, remained on his throne in Persepolis, surrounded by advisors who whispered of future campaigns. The Greek cities along the Ionian coast Miletus, Ephesus, Halicarnassus, remained vulnerable to Persian retaliation. The islands of the Aegean Sea stood exposed, like precious jewels waiting to be plucked by the next Persian expedition. The question that haunted every Greek assembly was simple yet profound. How could a collection of fiercely independent city-states, each jealous of its autonomy and suspicious of its neighbors, hope to stand against an empire that could mobilize hundreds of thousands of warriors? The answer, Greek leaders concluded, lay in unity, a revolutionary concept for a people who had spent centuries fighting among themselves. The sacred island and the solemn oath. In the spring of 478 BCE, representatives from Greek city-states across the Aegean gathered on the sacred island of Delos. This was no arbitrary choice. Delos, a tiny island barely 5 kilometers in circumference, held profound significance in Greek religion and culture. According to legend, it was the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, where the goddess Leto had found refuge from Hera's wrath. The island's sanctuary, with its magnificent temples and treasuries, served as a neutral ground where all Greeks could meet as equals before the gods. The atmosphere on Delos that spring was electric with possibility and danger. Delegates arrived from across the Greek world, from the proud maritime cities of Ionia, from the scattered islands of the Cyclades and Dodecanese, from the prosperous communities along the Hellespont and the Bosporus. Each city sent its most eloquent speakers and wisest statesmen, men who understood that the decisions made here would shape the destiny of the Greek world for generations to come. The driving force behind this gathering was Athens, represented by its brilliant strategos Aristides, a man so renowned for his fairness that his fellow citizens had nicknamed him the Just. Alongside him stood Cimon, son of the great Marathon Victor Miltiades, a charismatic leader who combined military genius with diplomatic skill. These Athenian leaders presented a vision that was both practical and inspiring. A permanent alliance of free Greek cities, bound by oath to mutual defense, pooling their resources to maintain a navy powerful enough to deter Persian aggression. The structure they proposed was ingenious in its simplicity. Each member city would contribute to the common defense according to its means and circumstances. The larger, wealthier cities could provide fully equipped warships, the magnificent triremes that had proven so devastating at Salamis. Each trireme required careful construction from select timber. A crew of 200 men, 170 rowers, 30 sailors and marines, and constant maintenance. Smaller cities that lacked shipbuilding facilities or naval traditions could contribute silver instead, a tribute assessed fairly based on their agricultural output, trade revenues, and population. The poorest communities might send soldiers, skilled craftsmen, or supplies. The ceremony that formalized this alliance was laden with ritual significance. As the sun rose over the Aegean on that momentous day, priests of Apollo conducted sacrifices at the island's great altar. Delegates from each city-state stepped forward to swear their oaths, their words carrying across the sacred precinct. They vowed to have the same friends and enemies, and to remain allied until iron floats, a poetic way of saying forever, since everyone knew iron sinks. To seal this eternal commitment, lumps of iron were ceremoniously hurled into the sea surrounding Delos, symbolic gestures that the alliance was meant to be indissoluble. The treaty established Delos as more than just the symbolic heart of the alliance. It became its administrative center. Here, in specially constructed buildings near Apollo's sanctuary, the League's treasury would be housed. Here, representatives would gather annually to debate policy, vote on military campaigns, and assess contributions. In theory, each member city possessed an equal vote in these assemblies, regardless of size or power. Athens might be the largest and most powerful member, but its vote counted the same as tiny Paros or distant Byzantium. The Athenian advantage. From the very beginning, however, Athens occupied a unique position within the League. This wasn't entirely by design. It emerged naturally from practical realities. Athens possessed the largest navy in the Greek world, with over 200 triremes more than all other League members combined. The city had invested heavily in naval infrastructure during the 480s BCE, following Themistocles' persuasive argument that Athens's future lay on the sea. The harbors of Piraeus had been transformed into the most sophisticated naval complex in the Mediterranean, with shipyards, warehouses, and fortifications that represented a massive capital investment. Moreover, Athens had developed what we might call institutional knowledge about naval warfare. The city's generals understood fleet tactics, supply logistics, and coastal warfare in ways that landlocked cities like Thebes or even traditional naval powers like Corinth simply didn't. Athenian triarchs, wealthy citizens who commanded individual warships, had proven their skill repeatedly in battles against Persia. The city's lower classes, who manned the oars, had become professional seamen through years of constant training and campaigning. This naval dominance gave Athens control over the League's most important resource, its military capability. When the League voted to conduct operations against Persian strongholds, it was Athenian commanders who led the expeditions, Athenian ships that formed the core of every fleet, and Athenian strategies that determined success or failure. The League's first major operation in 476 BCE, the capture of Ion on the Thracian coast, was commanded by the Athenian general Cimon. When the League laid siege to Skyros in 475 BCE, clearing the island of pirates, it was again Athenian leadership that proved decisive. Aristides the Just took on the crucial task of assessing each city's contribution, the phoros or tribute. He traveled throughout the League's territory, examining each community's resources, population, and economic potential. His assessments were generally accepted as fair, establishing an initial annual contribution of approximately 460 talents of silver, an enormous sum representing millions of days of labor. Some cities paid less than 1 talent, Major cities like Thassos or Aegina contributed several talents. But here lay a subtle transformation. As more cities chose to pay silver rather than provide ships, Athens gained increasing control over the League's military resources. By 470 BCE, only the largest islands, Chios, Lesbos, and Samos, still maintained their own fleets. The rest paid tribute that Athens used to build more ships and pay more rowers. Each new Athenian trireme represented not just military power, but political leverage. The first cracks, Naxos and the price of rebellion. The transformation from alliance to empire began not with a dramatic policy announcement, but with a crisis that tested the League's fundamental principles. In 470 BCE, the prosperous island of Naxos, one of the League's founding members, attempted to withdraw from the alliance. The Naxians' reasoning seemed sound to them. Persia had been driven back, the Aegean was secure, and they saw no reason to continue paying tribute and contributing ships to what seemed an increasingly expensive and unnecessary alliance. The Naxian decision sparked heated debate in Athens and throughout the League. Some argued that if the Persian threat had indeed receded, perhaps cities should be allowed to leave if they wished. Others contended that Naxos's withdrawal would set a dangerous precedent. If one city could leave, others would follow, and the carefully constructed alliance would unravel just when it was most needed. The Persians, though temporarily subdued, remained a threat. Xerxes them still ruled in Persia, and his satraps in Asia Minor watched the Greek coastal cities with hungry eyes. The Athenian response was swift and uncompromising. A fleet under Ximon's command sailed to Naxos in 469 BCE. The Athenians didn't come to negotiate, they came to compel. After a siege that lasted several months, Naxos was forced to surrender. The terms were harsh and unprecedented. The city's fortifications were demolished, its fleet was confiscated, and it was compelled to pay tribute in silver rather than providing ships. Most significantly, Naxos lost its autonomy in foreign policy and its equal vote in League councils. The message was clear and chilling. Membership in the Delian League was no longer voluntary. The alliance of free cities had become something else, a structure from which exit was impossible, maintained not by mutual consent, but by Athenian military power. Yet the operation was justified in League councils through careful argument. The member cities had sworn sacred oaths to remain allied until iron floats. Breaking such oaths offended the gods and threatened everyone's security. If Naxos could abandon its obligations, why couldn't others? The League's common defense required reliable commitments from all members. Thassos: wealth, defiance, and submission. The pattern established at Naxos repeated itself with even greater intensity at Thassos, a large and wealthy island off the Thracian coast, rich in gold and silver mines. In 465 BCE, Thassos came into conflict with Athens over mining rights and trading posts on the Thracian mainland. The dispute escalated rapidly into open rebellion against Athenian authority. Thassos was no minor city. It possessed a powerful fleet, strong fortifications, and substantial financial resources. Its leaders believed they could successfully resist Athenian pressure. The Thasian revolt represented a fundamental challenge to Athens' evolving dominance. If Thasos, one of the League's wealthiest and most powerful members, could successfully defy Athens, it would demonstrate that Athenian control was not absolute. Other cities might be emboldened to assert their independence or resist Athenian directives. The stakes extended far beyond one island's grievances. They touched on the basic question of who truly controlled the Delian League. Athens responded with overwhelming force. Cimon, now at the height of his power and prestige, led a large fleet to Thasos in 465 BCE. What followed was one of the longest and most brutal sieges of the era. The Athenians established a complete naval blockade, cutting Thasos off from external support and supplies. They systematically devastated the island's agricultural land, destroying vineyards and olive groves that represented generations of careful cultivation. Thasian ships that attempted to break the blockade were hunted down and captured or sunk. The siege dragged on for 3 years. Inside Thasos, conditions deteriorated as food stocks dwindled and hope faded. The Thasians had appealed to Sparta, the great land power that viewed Athens' growing maritime empire with increasing concern. The Spartans had apparently promised to help by invading Attica, forcing Athens to recall its fleet from Thasos. But in 464 BCE, a catastrophic earthquake struck Sparta, killing thousands and triggering a massive revolt by Sparta's Helot slaves. The promised intervention never came, and Thasos faced Athens alone. In 463 BCE, starving and exhausted, Thasos surrendered on terms dictated by Athens. The settlement was even harsher than that imposed on Naxos. Thasos's defensive walls were torn down, stone by stone. A humiliation that left the city defenseless. Its entire fleet was confiscated and added to Athenian naval strength. The city was forced to abandon its profitable mining operations and trading posts on the Thracian mainland, which Athens took over. Most crushing of all, Thasos was required to pay an immediate indemnity and ongoing annual tribute that was substantially increased from its previous contribution. The fall of Thasos sent shockwaves through the league. If mighty Thasos, with its wealth and military power, could be reduced to submission after 3 years of defiant resistance, what hope did smaller cities have? The message was unmistakable. Resistance to Athens was not merely futile, it was ruinous. The imperial machinery, 454 BCE, and the final transformation. The year 454 BCE marked a watershed in the League's transformation from alliance to empire. The trigger was a military disaster in Egypt, where an Athenian expedition supporting a revolt against Persian rule ended in catastrophic defeat. The loss was staggering. Perhaps 200 ships and tens of thousands of men perished in the Egyptian debacle. For Athens, it represented not just a military setback, but a profound strategic vulnerability. The Athenians, however, proved masters at turning crisis into opportunity. They argued that the Egyptian disaster demonstrated that the League's treasury was unsafe on Delos, vulnerable to Persian raid or seizure. Therefore, they declared, it must be moved to Athens for safekeeping specifically to the Parthenon in the fortified Acropolis under the protection of the goddess Athena herself. The decision was presented as a security measure, necessary for the League's preservation. But the transfer of the treasury from Delos to Athens represented far more than a security precaution. It was the final unmistakable step in Athens' transformation from alliance leader to imperial master. The sacred island of Delos, where representatives of equal city-states had once gathered, was reduced to a mere religious shrine. The annual League assembly that had met there ceased to function as a genuine deliberative body. Decisions were now made in Athens by Athenian citizens in Athenian assemblies for Athenian interests. The fate of the League's silver reveals the transformation's extent. Initially, all tribute was supposed to be used exclusively for common defense-building ships, paying rowers, maintaining fleets. But once the treasury sat in Athens, the line between League funds and Athenian revenues became increasingly blurred. The brilliant Athenian statesman Pericles, who emerged as Athens' dominant leader in the 450s and 440s BCE, pursued an extraordinarily ambitious building program. The magnificent Parthenon, constructed between 447 and 432 BCE, was supposedly built to honor Athena Parthenos, the virgin goddess who protected all Greeks. But everyone knew it was paid for, largely with League tribute, technically the common funds of the alliance, but in practice Athenian silver, spent on Athenian monuments, designed by Athenian architects, built by Athenian craftsmen and foreign laborers working in Athens. When some of Athens' allies objected to this appropriation of League funds for purely Athenian purposes, Pericles reportedly responded with breathtaking arrogance. "They do not give us a single horse, not a soldier, not a ship. All they supply is money, and this belongs not to the people who give it, but to those who receive it, so long as they provide the services they are paid for." The statement was revealing. Athens now viewed the tribute not as contributions to a common cause, but as payment for protection services rendered at Athens' discretion. The price of empire. Methods of control by the 440s. BCE, Athens had developed sophisticated mechanisms for maintaining control over its empire. These went far beyond military dominance to encompass legal, economic, and cultural dimensions of power. One of the most effective tools was the legal system. Athens required that serious legal cases involving League members be tried in Athenian courts before Athenian juries. This meant that political leaders from subject cities could be brought to Athens on charges of treason or corruption, removed from their communities, and subjected to judgments by foreigners who naturally sympathized with Athenian interests. The system ensured that local elites remained dependent on Athenian goodwill and hesitant to challenge Athenian authority. Economic integration reinforced political control. Athens mandated that all League members use Athenian weights, measures, and coinage. This was presented as promoting trade efficiency, and indeed, it did facilitate commerce throughout the Aegean. But it also meant that local economic sovereignty was diminished. Cities that had once proudly minted their own coins, stamped with their own symbols, were now required to use Athenian owls, silver coins bearing the image of Athena's sacred bird. The economic standardization created dependencies that made independence increasingly difficult to imagine. Athens also employed what we might call colonial methods. In strategically important or recently rebellious cities, Athens established clerocus settlements of Athenian citizens who were given land confiscated from local populations. These clerocus served multiple purposes. They provided land for Athens's landless poor. They established loyal Athenian populations in potentially troublesome areas, and they served as permanent garrisons, ready to suppress local resistance. By the 430s BCE, thousands of Athenian citizens lived in cleruches, scattered throughout the empire, from the Hellespont to Euboea to the Thracian coast. The cultural hegemony, the attraction of Athens. Yet Athens' empire was maintained not solely through coercion. There was also attraction, even genuine admiration. The Athens of Pericles' age was experiencing what we might call a golden age, a period of extraordinary cultural creativity that made the city the intellectual and artistic center of the Greek world. The city attracted talent from throughout the Mediterranean. Philosophers like Anaxagoras of Clazomenae and Protagoras of Abdera made their careers in Athens. Historians like Herodotus of Halicarnassus presented their works to Athenian audiences. The tragic playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides explored profound questions of justice, fate, and human nature in performances attended by citizens from across the empire. The comic poet Aristophanes mocked and criticized Athenian policies, including imperial policies, with a freedom of speech that was remarkable for the ancient world. The physical splendor of Athens was equally impressive. The Parthenon, gleaming with new marble, its pediments filled with elaborate sculpture, its interior housing a massive gold and ivory statue of Athena, stood as a testament to Athenian wealth and artistic achievement. The Propylaea, the monumental gateway to the Acropolis, welcomed visitors with columns and painted ceilings. Throughout the city, new temples, stoas, and public buildings transformed Athens into what Pericles called an education to Greece. Many Greeks from subject cities felt ambivalent about Athenian rule. They resented the tribute, the interference in local affairs, and the loss of autonomy. But they also recognized that Athenian power had brought tangible benefits: peace throughout the Aegean, suppression of piracy, flourishing trade, and exposure to the most vibrant culture in the Greek world. Sons of wealthy families from League cities came to study in Athens, absorbing Athenian ideas and often developing affection for the imperial city. The mechanisms of resistance and control. Despite Athens's cultural attractions and the real benefits of peace and prosperity, resistance to Athenian dominance never completely disappeared. It took various forms, from subtle non-cooperation to open rebellion, and Athens developed increasingly sophisticated responses to each challenge. Passive resistance was common. Cities might delay tribute payments, claiming poor harvests or trading difficulties. They might drag their feet in supplying rowers or soldiers for League expeditions. Local officials might interpret Athenian directives in ways that minimized their impact. Such resistance was difficult for Athens to combat directly, without appearing tyrannical or expending disproportionate resources. More serious were attempts at conspiracy and organized revolt. Throughout the 440s and 430s BCE, there were periodic uprisings. Euboea rebelled in 446 BCE and was harshly suppressed. Several cities in Thrace attempted to leave the League in the same period. Each revolt followed a similar pattern: initial defiance, appeals to Sparta or other powers for support, Athenian military response, and eventual submission followed by punishment. Athens' responses became increasingly systematic. The democracy developed what might be called an imperial bureaucracy. Officials, called Hellenotamiai, collected and managed the tribute. Other officials, called episkopoi, inspectors, were sent to subject cities to supervise local affairs and ensure compliance with Athenian directives. A network of informants reported on potential dissension or conspiracy. Athenian garrisons were stationed in strategic locations, not just to defend against external threats, but to maintain internal control. The tribute itself was periodically reassessed, usually upward. The initial assessment of 460 talents in 478 BCE had grown by the 430s BCE to over 600 talents, a massive increase that reflected both Athens's growing resource needs and its confidence in its ability to extract wealth from subject cities. Some cities saw their assessments triple or quadruple. The reassessments were conducted by Athenian officials, according to Athenian calculations of each city's ability to pay, with limited input from the cities themselves. Sparta's growing concern, the imperial rivalry, as Athens' empire expanded and consolidated, Sparta watched with growing alarm. Sparta, the great land power of Greece, had its own alliance system, the Peloponnesian League, quite different in character from Athens' maritime empire. Spartan allies were technically autonomous. They weren't subject to tribute or routine interference in internal affairs. But they were required to follow Sparta's lead in foreign policy and provide military forces when called upon. The contrast between the two systems became starker over time. Spartan leaders, particularly those of a conservative bent, viewed Athens' empire as a fundamental threat to Greek liberty. They saw Athens transforming from a defender of Greek freedom against Persia into a new tyrant, imposing its will on Greek cities just as Persia had attempted to do. Some Spartans argued that Athens' growing wealth and power, if left unchecked, would eventually threaten even Sparta's independence. Moreover, the ideological dimension of the rivalry intensified during this period. Athens was a radical democracy, where even the poorest citizens had a vote and could speak in the assembly. Athenian policy encouraged democracy in subject cities, knowing that democratic factions generally favored Athens, while oligarchic elites often resented Athenian interference. Sparta, by contrast, was a militaristic oligarchy with a rigid social hierarchy. Spartans generally supported oligarchic governments in their allied cities. Thus, the Athenian-Spartan rivalry became not just a struggle between two powers, but a clash of ideologies and ways of life. Athens represented naval power, commerce, democracy, intellectual inquiry, and cultural dynamism. Sparta embodied land power, military discipline, oligarchy, traditional values, and cultural conservatism. The tension between these two visions of Greek civilization made conflict increasingly likely. The empire on the eve of war. By 432 BCE, when disputes between Athens and Sparta finally erupted into the Peloponnesian War, the Delian League had been completely transformed. What had begun 56 years earlier as a voluntary alliance of free cities united by common danger had become an Athenian empire. The Athenians themselves used the word arch rule or dominion, maintained by naval power, financial extraction, legal coercion, and when necessary, brutal force. The numbers tell part of the story. The League had grown from perhaps 150 cities in 478 BCE to include nearly 300 subject states by 432 BCE. The annual tribute had increased from 460 to over 600 talents. Athens had constructed over 300 triremes, making its navy larger than all other Greek navies combined. The city's population had swelled, including perhaps 40,000 adult male citizens, plus women and children, tens of thousands of resident foreigners, metics, and a massive enslaved population. But statistics alone don't capture the transformation's full significance. The Delian League's evolution from alliance to empire represented a fundamental shift in Greek political relationships. The fierce independence that had always characterized Greek city-states, the jealous preservation of autonomy that made Greeks so difficult to unite, even against existential threats, had been subordinated in the Aegean region to Athenian power. The price of security against Persia was submission to Athens. The irony was profound, and would not have been lost on thoughtful observers. The Greeks had fought Persia to preserve their freedom eleutheria, the right of each polis to govern itself according to its own laws and customs. Yet in defending that freedom, Athens had created a system that in many ways resembled the Persian Empire it had defeated. Like Persia, Athens demanded tribute from subject peoples. Like Persia, it maintained military garrisons in strategic locations. Like Persia, it interfered in local governments to ensure compliant leadership. Like Persia, it crushed revolts with overwhelming force. Legacy and historical significance. The Delian League's transformation would have profound consequences for Greek history. The empire Athens built became both a source of strength and a cause of its eventual downfall. The resources extracted from subject cities funded Athens' golden age, the magnificent buildings, the theatrical festivals, the philosophical schools, the artistic achievements that we still admire today. But the empire also generated resentment and fear that would drive many Greek cities into Sparta's arms when war came. The Peloponnesian War, 431–404 BCE, was, in many ways, a war about the Athenian Empire. Sparta and its allies fought ostensibly to liberate Greece from Athenian tyranny. Many of Athens' subjects waited eagerly for opportunities to revolt when Athenian power was stretched thin or weakened by defeat. The war would ultimately end with Athens' complete defeat, the dismantling of its empire, and a period of Spartan hegemony that proved even more oppressive than Athenian rule had been. Yet the legacy of the Delian League extended far beyond its own era. It represented one of history's first examples of a voluntary defensive alliance transforming into an empire, a pattern that would repeat throughout human history. The mechanisms Athens developed for controlling its empire tribute extraction, legal integration, cultural hegemony, strategic garrisons would be studied and emulated by later imperial powers from Rome to modern times. The Delian League also raised enduring questions about freedom, security, and power. Can a league of free states remain truly free when one member possesses overwhelming power? Does collective security inevitably lead to domination by the strongest? Can the means used to preserve liberty ultimately destroy it? These questions, first confronted by the Greeks of the Delian League, remain relevant to international relations and alliance systems in our own time. The transformation of the Delian League from alliance to empire stands as a cautionary tale about how noble purposes defending Greek freedom against Persian tyranny can evolve into their opposite when power becomes concentrated and unchecked. It reminds us that empires are often built not through initial conquest, but through the gradual transformation of relationships initially based on consent and mutual benefit into systems of control and extraction. And it demonstrates how military strength, economic integration, legal systems, and cultural prestige can combine to create structures of dominance that, once established, become extremely difficult for subject peoples to challenge or escape. The Greek poleis that gathered on Delos in 478 BCE, swearing eternal oaths as they hurled iron into the sea, could not have imagined where their alliance would lead. They sought security against a foreign threat and believed they had found it through voluntary cooperation. Instead, they created the conditions for one of them, brilliant, ambitious Athens, to build an empire that would both illuminate and darken the Aegean world for a generation. The rebirth of Athens, phoenix from the ashes. The desolation, a city reduced to ruins. In the late summer of 480 BCE, Athens lay in utter devastation. The Persian army under King Xerxes had swept through Attica like a terrible storm, leaving destruction in its wake. The once proud city that had defeated the Persians at Marathon just 10 years earlier was now a landscape of nightmares. Temples that had stood for generations were reduced to blackened shells, their wooden roofs consumed by flames, their painted columns cracked and toppled. The ancient olive groves that had sustained Athenian families for centuries, some trees said to be hundreds of years old, were hacked down or burned. Houses throughout the city were systematically demolished, their walls pulled down, their contents looted or destroyed. The Acropolis, Athens' sacred heart, had suffered the worst fate imaginable. The old temple of Athena Polias, which had housed the city's most precious sacred objects for over a century, was deliberately torched by Persian soldiers. The flames consumed not just wood and paint, but centuries of offerings, dedications, and artistic treasures. The limestone foundations cracked in the intense heat. Statues of gods and heroes were thrown down and smashed. Everything that could burn was set ablaze. Everything that couldn't was defiled or destroyed. The Persians wanted not merely to conquer Athens, but to erase it, to obliterate any memory of the city that had dared to defy the great king. When Athenian citizens returned in the autumn of 479 BCE, after their decisive victory at Plataea had finally driven the Persians from Greek soil, they found a city that barely resembled what they had left. Entire neighborhoods were unrecognizable. Familiar streets were choked with rubble. The agora, the bustling marketplace that had been the center of civic life, was a wasteland of collapsed stoas and ruined shops. Families searching for their homes often couldn't find them amid the debris. The air still smelled of smoke and destruction months after the fires had burned out. Yet in this moment of utter devastation, something remarkable was born. The Athenians, rather than despairing, saw opportunity. The destruction of the old city meant they could build something new, something greater than what had existed before. The ashes of 480 BCE would become, in a sense that the Athenians themselves would have appreciated, the fertile soil from which a new Athens would grow. The first phase, survival and defense, 479-470 BCE. The immediate priority was survival and security. Even as citizens salvaged what they could from the ruins, Athenian leaders understood that the city remained vulnerable. The Persian threat, though temporarily defeated, had not disappeared. King Xerxes still ruled his vast empire from Persepolis, and everyone knew he harbored thoughts of revenge. Moreover, Sparta, Athens' supposed ally, was already viewing Athens' growing power with suspicion and jealousy. The statesman Themistocles, the brilliant strategist whose vision had led to the naval victory at Salamis, immediately grasped the essential truth. Athens' future depended on walls. In 479-478 BCE, he orchestrated one of the most remarkable construction projects in Greek history, the rebuilding of Athens' defensive circuit under conditions of extreme urgency and international pressure. Sparta, fearing a fortified Athens, sent ambassadors urging the Athenians not to rebuild their walls, arguing that fortified cities could serve as bases for future Persian invasions. Themistocles' response was as clever as it was bold. He traveled to Sparta to discuss the matter, deliberately stalling and equivocating while secretly sending messages to Athens. Build the walls with all possible speed, using every available person, and incorporate whatever materials come to hand. And so Athens witnessed an extraordinary spectacle. Every citizen capable of lifting stone became a builder. Men, women, even children worked frantically on the walls. They used not just quarried stone, but whatever lay at hand-columned drums from destroyed temples, funerary monuments, blocks from demolished houses. The new walls became a monument not just to defensive necessity, but to the destruction Athens had survived. Even today, archaeologists can identify pieces of archaic temples and sculptures built into those fortification walls, silent testimony to the urgency of that reconstruction. When the walls reached a defensible height and Themistocles could no longer stall the Spartans, he revealed what had been accomplished. Sparta was furious, but could do nothing. Athens was now protected by fortifications that stretched nearly 6 kilometers in circumference, enclosing the city in a defensive embrace. Simultaneously, Themistocles pushed forward his grand vision of transforming Piraeus, Athens' natural harbor, into the greatest port in the Mediterranean. New fortification walls surrounded Piraeus, and shipyards were expanded to accommodate Athens' growing fleet. During these years of immediate post-war recovery, Athens remained a construction site of necessity rather than beauty. Housing was rebuilt in the simplest, most practical style. Temples remained ruined. There were more pressing needs. The city was functional, but not yet glorious. Citizens focused on rebuilding their lives, their homes, their farms. The olive groves slowly began to recover. New trees were planted that would take decades to mature. Trade gradually resumed as Athenian merchants reconnected with partners throughout the Mediterranean. The vision takes form. Enter Pericles, 460s, 450s BCE. By the 460s BCE, Athens had recovered from immediate devastation and was growing wealthy from its expanding empire. The Delian League, originally formed to defend against Persia, was bringing in substantial annual tribute. Hundreds of talents of silver flowing into Athens each year. The city's population was expanding as people from throughout Attica and beyond were drawn to the opportunities available in this increasingly prosperous polis. It was in this context that Pericles emerged as Athens' dominant political figure. Born around 495 BCE, into one of Athens' most aristocratic families, his mother was a member of the Alcmaeonid clan, which traced its lineage to mythical heroes. Pericles combined aristocratic connections with genuinely democratic instincts. Unlike many wealthy Athenians who viewed democracy with suspicion, Pericles embraced it and made himself the champion of the common people. But Pericles was no mere populist demagogue. He possessed a vision of Athens that was simultaneously practical and transcendent. He saw that the city's wealth, power, and democratic culture could combine to create something unprecedented in the Greek world, a city that would be not just politically dominant, but culturally magnificent, a beacon that would inspire admiration throughout the Mediterranean. Athens, in Pericles' vision, would become what he would later call in his famous funeral oration An Education to Greece, a city whose very existence would demonstrate what free people could achieve. The key to realizing this vision was transforming the physical city itself. Athens in the 460s BCE was still largely a collection of modest houses and public buildings hastily reconstructed after the Persian invasion. The Acropolis remained a landscape of ruins, its temples still destroyed, a constant reminder of Persian sacrilege. Pericles saw this as intolerable. Athens was the wealthiest, most powerful city in Greece. Why should its physical appearance not reflect its status? Around 454 BCE, when the treasury of the Delian League was transferred from the island of Delos to Athens, ostensibly for security reasons after a disastrous Egyptian expedition, Pericles saw his opportunity. The tribute that had been collected for common defense would now be available, at least in part, for an ambitious building program that would transform Athens into the most spectacular city in the Greek world. The great building program begins, 450s BCE. The scope of what Pericles envisioned was breathtaking. This would not be mere rebuilding. It would be wholesale reimagining of Athens' sacred and civic spaces on a scale never before attempted in the Greek world. The Acropolis would be completely rebuilt with temples that would surpass anything previously constructed. New civic buildings would grace the agora. The city would become an architectural showcase, demonstrating Athenian wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. The political opposition was immediate and fierce. Conservative Athenians, particularly those of oligarchic sympathies, were outraged. Thucydides, son of Milesius, not the historian, but a prominent conservative politician, led the opposition, arguing that Pericles was misappropriating funds meant for common defense. The allies contributed their tribute. Thucydides thundered in the assembly to maintain fleets and soldiers for protection against Persia, not to gild Athens with marble temples and gold statues. Athens, he charged, was behaving like a vain woman, adorning herself with precious stones, while her allies struggled under the burden of tribute. Pericles' response, as recorded by Plutarch, was characteristically bold. He argued that Athens provided the service for which allies paid protection from Persian aggression. How Athens chose to spend that revenue, so long as the protection was maintained, was Athens' own business. "They do not give us a single horse, not a soldier, not a ship," Pericles reportedly said. "All they supply is money, and this belongs not to the people who give it, but to those who receive it, so long as they provide the services they are paid for." But Pericles also made a more positive argument that resonated with ordinary Athenian citizens. The building program would provide employment for thousands of Athenians. It would bring glory to the city and honor to the gods. It would demonstrate that Athens, under democratic government, could achieve cultural excellence that rivaled or exceeded anything accomplished by the old aristocratic orders or by tyrants. The buildings would stand for generations as monuments to what free citizens working together could accomplish. The Athenian assembly, dominated by Pericles' supporters, voted approval. The greatest construction program in Greek history would proceed. What followed over the next 4 decades transformed not just Athens, but the entire concept of what a city could be. The workers. A city becomes a workshop. As word spread throughout the Greek world that Athens was embarking on an unprecedented building program, the city became a magnet for skilled workers of every description. From every corner of the Mediterranean, they came drawn by the promise of steady employment, good wages paid in reliable Athenian silver, and the opportunity to work on projects that would define their craft for generations. Stone masons arrived from islands famous for their marble quarries, from Paros, whose brilliant white marble was prized for sculpture, from Naxos, whose stone had a subtle, warm hue, and from Pentelicon, the mountain northeast of Athens itself, whose marble would become the signature material of the Athenian building program. These masons understood stone in ways that seem almost mystical today. They could read the grain of marble, knowing exactly where to place the chisel to split a block cleanly. They understood how different stones would weather, how they would catch and reflect light, how to cut them so that joins became nearly invisible. Sculptors came from throughout the Greek world, each bringing regional styles and techniques that would blend into something new and magnificent under Athenian patronage. There were masters trained in the severe, archaic style, with its formal poses and mysterious smiles. there were younger artists experimenting with more naturalistic approaches, trying to capture the actual movement of human bodies, the complex emotions of human faces. There were specialists in different scales. Some excelled at colossal statues that would dominate temple pediments, others at small-scale relief work that required microscopic precision. Architects arrived with revolutionary ideas about proportion, optical refinement, and structural innovation. Ictinus and Callicrates, who would design the Parthenon, brought sophisticated mathematical understanding of how buildings could be designed to appear perfectly straight, even though subtle curves and adjustments were incorporated throughout, to account for optical illusions. Menzicles, who would design the Propylaea, understood how monumental gateways could control and choreograph visitors' experience as they approached sacred spaces. Carpenters, specialized in different kinds of woodwork, came to construct the elaborate scaffolding required for building temples, the forms needed for certain kinds of masonry work, and eventually the wooden elements of the buildings themselves: doors, ceiling beams, roof structures. Painters arrived, including specialists in the elaborate painted decoration that would cover temple sculptures and architectural elements. Ancient Greek temples, we must remember, were not the pristine white marble structures we see today, but were vibrantly painted in colors, reds, blues, golds, that would seem almost garish to modern taste, but that the Greeks found appropriately divine. Metal workers came, particularly those skilled in bronze casting and gold working. The massive bronze and gold and ivory statues that would grace the temples required specialists in techniques like hollow casting and chryselephantine work, combining gold and ivory over wooden cores. These were among the most highly skilled craftsmen in the ancient world, their knowledge passed down through generations of apprenticeship. Supporting all these skilled artisans was an army of laborers' men who quarried the stone, transported it on wagons or ships, hoisted blocks into place with elaborate pulley systems, mixed mortar, carried water, prepared food, and performed the 1,000 small tasks essential to any major construction project. Many of these were Athenian citizens, the common people who rode in the fleet and voted in the assembly, now earning steady wages in the building trades. Others were metics, resident foreigners, freed slaves, and even enslaved workers, all working side by side on the most ambitious public works program the Greek world had ever seen. The Acropolis rises, the Parthenon, 447-432 BCE. The centerpiece of the entire building program was the Parthenon, the great temple of Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin, that would crown the Acropolis and dominate Athens' skyline for millennia to come. Construction began in 447 BCE, under the supervision of the sculptor Phidias, who served as overall artistic director for the project, with architects Ictinus and Callicrates handling the architectural design. The site chosen was not empty ground, but the platform of an earlier temple that had been under construction when the Persians attacked in 480 BCE. That older temple, never completed, had been destroyed in the Persian sack. For nearly 30 years, its ruined foundations had stood as a memorial to Persian sacrilege. Now they would become the base for something far more magnificent. The scale was unprecedented for a Greek temple. The Parthenon would measure roughly 70 meters long and 31 meters wide, with 46 massive Doric columns supporting a roof that rose over 13 meters above the stylobate, the temple's platform. But mere size, impressive as it was, represented only the beginning. The Parthenon would incorporate refinements and subtleties that pushed Greek architectural sophistication to its absolute peak. The columns, which appear perfectly straight and vertical, are actually slightly curved, swelling subtly outward in the middle, a feature called entasis, to counteract the optical illusion that would make truly straight columns appear to cave inward. The entire platform of the temple curves upward very slightly, at its center only about 11 centimeters over its length, but enough to prevent the optical illusion of sagging that a truly flat platform would create. The corner columns are slightly thicker than the others and lean almost imperceptibly inward. Every column tilts slightly toward the center of the building. These refinements, invisible to casual observation, but subliminally creating a sense of perfect harmony, required extraordinary precision in cutting and placing over 20,000 tons of marble. The sculptural program was even more ambitious. The two pediments, the triangular spaces at the building's east and west ends, were filled with elaborate three-dimensional sculpture. The east pediment depicted the birth of Athena, springing fully armed from Zeus' head, surrounded by gods and goddesses reacting to this miraculous event. The west pediment showed Athena's contest with Poseidon for patronage of Athens, with the city's legendary first king and his daughters witnessing the competition. Around all four sides of the building, just below the roofline, ran a continuous sculptured frieze in low relief, the famous Parthenon frieze depicting the Panathenaic procession, the great festival held every 4 years in Athena's honor. This 160-meter-long frieze showed hundreds of figures cavalrymen on prancing horses, chariots, musicians, cattle being led to sacrifice, young women carrying ritual objects, magistrates, and finally the gods themselves receiving the procession. The frieze represented not mythological past, but contemporary Athens, the democratic citizens of the city honored alongside gods and heroes. The exterior metopes 92, separate sculptured panels, depicted 4 different mythological battles: Greeks fighting Amazons, Lapiths fighting centaurs, gods fighting giants, and Greeks sacking Troy. All these myths carried the same message: civilization triumphing over barbarism, order overcoming chaos, Greek virtue defeating foreign aggression themes that resonated powerfully with Athenians who had lived through the Persian invasions. Inside the temple stood the statue that was in many ways the entire project's culmination, Phidias's massive chryselephantine statue of Athena Parthenos. Standing roughly 12 meters tall, the statue depicted Athena in full armor, holding a small figure of Nike, Victory, in her right hand, and with her shield resting at her left side. The statue's skin was made of ivory plates, carefully fitted over a wooden frame, while her clothing, armor, and accessories were crafted from removable gold plates totaling perhaps 40 talents, over 1,000 kilograms of gold. The statue's eyes were precious stones, and its overall impact, standing in the dimly lit interior of the temple, must have been overwhelming, a golden warrior goddess radiating divine power. The cost was staggering. Ancient sources suggest the Parthenon consumed roughly 470 talents, perhaps $500 million in modern currency, though such comparisons are always problematic. More importantly, it consumed 15 years of focused effort by hundreds of the Mediterranean's most skilled craftsmen and thousands of laborers. The Propylaea, gateway to the divine, 437-432 BCE. Even as work continued on the Parthenon, Pericles initiated another ambitious project, the Propylaea, the monumental gateway that would control access to the Acropolis. The architect Mnesicles designed a complex structure that was simultaneously fortress, temple, and art gallery. A building that would choreograph visitors' experience as they climbed the steep path to the Acropolis summit. The propylaea consisted of a central building with two flanking wings. The central section had a deep porch on both the western entrance and eastern exit sides, each supported by 6 massive Doric columns. Visitors approaching from the city would climb a broad stairway and pass through these columns into a covered corridor where the ceiling was painted and decorated with gold stars. The passageway rose steadily upward, building anticipation, before opening onto the summit of the Acropolis where the Parthenon suddenly burst into view. The northern wing of the propylaea served as a pinakothek, literally a picture storage, one of the world's first art galleries. Here, panels painted by famous artists were displayed for public viewing, a remarkable instance of art being made accessible to ordinary citizens, rather than reserved for aristocratic private enjoyment. The propylaea project was interrupted by the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in 431 BCE and was never fully completed according to Mnesicles' original design. The southern wing remained smaller than planned, probably due to objections from priests of neighboring sanctuaries who claimed the construction encroached on sacred ground. Nevertheless, even in its incomplete state, the propylaea was recognized throughout the ancient world as an architectural masterpiece. Other Acropolis monuments, 430s, 420s BCE. The Acropolis building program continued even as Athens plunged into the devastating Peloponnesian War with Sparta. In 427 BCE, construction began on the Temple of Athena Nike, Athena of Victory, a small but exquisitely proportioned temple that stood on a bastion projecting from the Acropolis's southwestern corner. Though tiny compared to the Parthenon, the temple was perfectly formed, with 4 Ionic columns, a more delicate order than the Doric columns of the Parthenon, on both front and back. Its sculptured frieze depicted Athenian military victories, while the temple itself served as a prayer that such victories would continue. The most architecturally innovative of all the Acropolis buildings was the Erechtheion, begun in 421 BCE during a temporary peace in the war, but not completed until 406 BCE, as Athens's resources dwindled and defeat loomed. This temple, built on the Acropolis's northern side, had to accommodate multiple sacred sites and cult practices on a steeply sloping, irregular plot. The architect's solution was brilliantly unconventional. Rather than a single rectangular building, the Erechtheion consisted of multiple interconnected sections at different levels. The building is famous today for its porch of the caryatid 6 draped female figures, serving as columns to support the southern porch's roof. These were not just decorative elements, but fully functional architecture, each figure carefully designed to bear substantial weight while appearing graceful and effortless. The identity and meaning of these figures remain debated. Were they priestesses, nymphs, or the daughters of King Erechtheus? But their artistic achievement is undeniable. Beyond the Acropolis, transforming the city, Pericles' building program extended far beyond the Acropolis. In the Agora, the civic heart of Athens, where citizens gathered to conduct business, socialize, and debate politics, new buildings created an architectural framework for democratic life. The Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios, Zeus the Liberator, constructed in the 430s BCE, provided covered colonnades where citizens could shelter from sun and rain while conducting business or conversation. The building's name commemorated Athens' liberation from Persian tyranny, linking the democratic present to the victories of the previous generation. The Hephaestion, a well-preserved Doric temple overlooking the agora from the west, was built in the 440s BCE and dedicated to Hephaestus, god of craftsmen and metalworkers, an appropriate patron for a city whose power increasingly rested on skilled artisans and manufacturing. The Odeon of Pericles, constructed around 445 BCE, was a roofed music hall where musical competitions and rehearsals for dramatic festivals could be held. Ancient sources describe it as designed to resemble the tent of the Persian king, a deliberate architectural statement that Athens had appropriated and surpassed Persian grandeur. Throughout the city, new fountains provided fresh water, new gymnasia offered spaces for athletic training and education, and new walls extended from Athens to Piraeus, the Long Walls, ensuring that even under siege, Athens would retain access to its port and thus to maritime supply lines. The human cost: labor, slavery, and inequality. Behind the magnificent buildings and inspiring vision was a less comfortable reality. The Athenian building program rested on a society deeply stratified by citizenship, wealth, and freedom. While citizen craftsmen earned good wages for skilled work, much of the heavy labor was performed by enslaved people who received no such compensation. The marble quarried from Mount Pentelicon was cut by workers who included many enslaved individuals laboring in brutal conditions. The blocks were transported by enslaved workers, alongside hired laborers. The construction sites themselves were mixed workplaces where citizen artisans, metic craftsmen, and enslaved laborers all contributed to the same projects. Women, who made up half the population, were almost entirely excluded from the public glory of the building program. Some worked in textile production, creating the elaborately embroidered peplos, robe, presented to Athena at the Panathenaic festival. But they could not vote on the projects, could not work as architects or sculptors, could not even attend most public events celebrating the building's completion. The magnificent city that Pericles described as an education to Greece educated primarily male citizens. Women, metics, and enslaved people experienced it very differently. The funding mechanism tribute, extracted from Athens' subject allies, many of whom resented their subjection, meant that the beautiful temples of Athens were built partly on the resentment and forced contributions of other Greeks. When Pericles proclaimed that Athens was an education to Greece, many Greeks throughout the Aegean might have responded that it was an expensive and unwanted education, funded by resources extracted from them without their consent. Pericles, the man behind the vision. To understand the Athenian building program, we must understand Pericles himself, the man who conceived, promoted, and defended it against constant opposition. Born around 495 BCE, he came of age during the Persian Wars and entered politics in the 460s BCE, gradually emerging as Athens' dominant statesman by the 440s BCE. Pericles combined seemingly contradictory qualities. He was an aristocrat who championed democracy, a man of refined culture who was popular with common citizens, an intellectual who was also an effective military commander. Ancient sources describe him as reserved and dignified in public, rarely showing emotion, carefully cultivating an image of incorruptible devotion to Athens' greatness. His oratory was legendary. He could sway the assembly even when arguing for unpopular policies. Opponents mockingly called him Zeus for his ability to thunder and lighten in debate. His personal life was unconventional. His companion was Aspasia of Miletus, a foreign woman of extraordinary intelligence who hosted a salon where philosophers, artists, and politicians gathered for conversation. Conservative Athenians were scandalized proper Athenian men, married citizen women for legitimate children, not foreign intellectuals for companionship and conversation. But Pericles defied convention, treating Aspasia as an equal partner in a way that foreshadowed modern relationships more than it reflected ancient Greek norms. Pericles' vision for Athens extended beyond buildings. He instituted pay for jury service, enabling poor citizens to participate in the legal system without losing wages. He supported dramatic festivals that made great tragedies and comedies accessible to all citizens. He promoted policies that expanded democratic participation, while simultaneously building the empire that made such democratic generosity possible. This paradox Pericles, as champion of Athenian democracy and architect of Athenian imperialism, reflects fundamental tensions in Athens' golden age. The plague, death, and legacy, 430–429 BCE. Pericles did not live to see the completion of most of the projects he initiated. When the Peloponnesian War erupted in 431 BCE, Athens adopted Pericles' strategy of abandoning the countryside, concentrating the population within the city walls, and relying on naval power and empire to sustain a long war of attrition. But this concentration of population created conditions for disaster. In 430 BCE, a devastating plague struck Athens. The overcrowded city, filled with refugees from the countryside, proved ideal for disease transmission. The plague, its exact nature remains debated. Typhus, typhoid, Ebola, and other diseases have been suggested, killed perhaps a quarter of Athens' population over 3 years. The historian Thucydides, who survived the disease, left a haunting description of social breakdown as traditional funeral rites were abandoned, laws lost their force, and people pursued pleasure desperately, believing death was imminent. Pericles himself fell victim in 429 BCE, dying in his mid-60s after a distinguished career spanning 3 decades. His death marked a turning point. Athens continued fighting, building, and creating art, but never again would it have a leader of comparable vision and ability to translate vision into reality. The building program continued into the 420s and 410s BCE, but as Athens' strategic position deteriorated, resources became scarcer and ambitions more constrained. Yet even as Athens struggled militarily, the buildings Pericles had initiated stood as monuments to what the city had achieved. The Parthenon, gleaming with new marble, dominated the Acropolis and the Athenian skyline. The Propylaea provided a magnificent gateway to the sacred precinct. New temples and public buildings throughout the city testified to Athenian wealth and culture. These buildings would outlast the Athenian Empire, outlast Athenian democracy, even outlast classical Greek civilization itself. The long shadow, influence, and preservation. The Athenian building program of the 5th century BCE established aesthetic and architectural standards that would influence Western civilization for over 2 millennia. Roman architects studied and imitated Greek temples, particularly the Parthenon, spreading Greek architectural forms throughout the Mediterranean and Europe. Renaissance architects rediscovered classical proportions and incorporated them into churches, palaces, and public buildings. Neoclassical architecture of the 18th and 19th centuries explicitly revived the Greek temple form for everything from government buildings to banks to museums. The Parthenon itself survived remarkably well for nearly 2,000 years, converted first into a Christian church and later into a mosque during Ottoman rule, but remaining structurally intact. Its greatest damage came in 1687, when Venetian artillery, besieging Ottoman-held Athens, scored a direct hit on the Parthenon, which the Ottomans were using as a powder magazine. The explosion destroyed the building's interior and much of its sculpture. Further damage occurred in the early 19th century, when Lord Elgin removed many of the surviving sculptures and shipped them to Britain, where they remain in the British Museum, subject of ongoing repatriation debates. Despite these injuries, the Parthenon still stands, and modern conservation efforts work to preserve and, where possible, restore what remains. The building remains a potent symbol of classical Athens, of democracy, of Western civilization, of architectural excellence, and of cultural heritage. Conclusion: Ashes to glory. The transformation of Athens from the ash-covered ruins of 480 BCE to the magnificent city of the mid-5th century represents one of history's most remarkable urban renewals. In less than 2 generations, Athenians converted catastrophic destruction into unprecedented cultural flowering. The physical city became an expression of political ideals, a demonstration that free citizens working collectively could achieve grandeur that rivaled anything produced by Eastern despotisms or traditional aristocracies. Yet this achievement rested on uncomfortable foundations. Empire and the extraction of resources from subject peoples, slavery, and the exclusion of most residents from full civic participation, war, and the constant threat of violence. The same buildings that proclaimed Athenian excellence to the Mediterranean world were funded partly by tribute that many Greeks resented paying, and built partly by enslaved workers who could never be citizens of the democracy they served. Pericles understood these contradictions, but believed the achievements justified the costs. In his funeral oration, delivered in 431 BCE to honor Athenians killed in the war's first year, he articulated the vision that motivated the building program. Our city is an education to Greece, and our citizens individually display versatility and grace. We love beauty with economy, and wisdom without softness. Wealth we employ for use rather than show. We alone regard a man who takes no part in public affairs, not as harmless, but as useless. And we Athenians decide policy or submit it to proper discussion. For we believe that action is not hampered by discussion, but by the lack of knowledge gained through discussion before action begins. This was the Athens that Pericles and his contemporaries built from the ashes, a city where beauty served civic purpose, where art expressed democratic ideals, where architecture embodied political philosophy. It was an imperfect achievement, contradictory and exclusionary, in ways we recognize today more clearly than the Athenians did. But it was also genuinely magnificent, a phoenix risen from Persian flames, to soar higher and shine brighter than anyone in 480 BCE could have imagined possible. The marble temples still stand, weathered and broken but enduring, testament to human creativity, ambition, and the power of vision to transform disaster into glory. In those broken columns and battered friezes, we can still see what Athens was, and what, in its greatest moment, it believed itself to be. A city where freedom and culture, power and beauty, democracy and excellence combined to create something unprecedented and, in essential ways, never surpassed.